Hello, friends. Matt Patricic here, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute. We are on day 3 of our current evangelization and live seminar with Mark Bradford, our fellow for persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The seminar title, for those of you who may just be joining us for the first time, is 3 Threats to the Disabled and What We Can Do About It. Day 3 in particular, Mark will be looking at disability and mental health, a path to healing. Again, I want to remind everybody of 2 things. These are interactive, so please open up that chat box right now, introduce yourself, where you're tuning in from. And for those of you who maybe weren't able to catch day 1 or day 2, remember all of this is uploaded just a few hours after we end onto the Word on Fire Institute platform. There you can find all of our past live seminars. So without further ado, let's get back to Mark on disability and mental health, a path to healing. Class is in session. Mark.
Ding.
All right.
Ding. The bell is rung.
We need a bell.
All right. Thank you, Matt. It's great to be back, and welcome back to those of you who've been with us before. And if you haven't been with us the last couple of days, welcome to today's seminar event. I was just sort of recapping the last couple of days before we launch into today's talk. We just finished talking about the new eugenics and our obsession with perfection, and then yesterday we talked about so-called sexual rights, and talked about how we can help develop healthy attitudes toward relationships and a healthy sexual development for individuals who have intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities in a culture that's really pushing this idea of a right to sexual expression in whatever way you should choose. How do we deal with that in the context of the morality of the Roman Catholic Church? What do we know to be the truth of the human person and the nature of our sexuality related to who we are as persons? So now today we're going on to the next level, and both of these things, of course, will impact this talk that we're having today, because in a culture, for those with intellectual disabilities, who look at a culture that is trying to put an end to their existence, there's a certain fallout from that. When Jerome Lejeune first started treating patients with Down syndrome at his clinic in Paris, Jerome Lejeune was the founder of the cause of Down syndrome, related it to the presence of an extra copy of the 21st chromosome. He had been on television debating an abortionist the evening before, and one of his patients came running into him and said, Dr. Lejeune, you have to save us. They're trying to kill us. So this, is people with intellectual disabilities. Many have the capacity to understand what's going on out there, and they have the capacity to know that there are people in this world who are trying to eliminate the presence of their peers. And that can certainly have a negative effect on their perception of themselves, and can feed into this problem of, anxiety, if nothing less. And then certainly when we're distorting the meaning of sexuality and encouraging individuals who are cognitively impaired in some sort of way, we're really putting them at risk for harm. And that sort of harm, sexual harm, whether it's from sexual violence or aggression levied against a person, or just an unhealthy attitude, can certainly, as we know in the typical population, have mental health effects to it. And so all of these things, while we're not talking about those specifically today, all of those things can also relate into the topic that we're addressing today, and that's the mental health crisis in our country broadly, and how that specifically is exacerbated among a population that tends to be forced into some isolation and loneliness, which is a major contributing factor, as we know. I just wanted to clarify a couple of things and amplify a couple of things I said yesterday before we go on. I mentioned when we were talking about issues of sexuality that the church really isn't doing much, and I used the program at Notre Dame as an example. And a very good one, the course that Mary O'Callaghan and Claire Kilbane teach, which is an online course that you can drop into, that would be very good to participate in. And I should have mentioned also the resources that are available through the National Catholic Partnership on Disability. If you go to ncpd.org and just search on sexuality, you can find the resources that they have there if you're interested. And I just wanted to mention too, for those of you who may not know, although if you're tuned into the IDD community at Word on Fire, you probably have heard us referencing before the new document that the bishops are developing. That is an update of a document from the 1970s that was revised a little bit in, I think, the 1990s to to bring some of the language up to date. But it's a new document that the bishops are preparing that I think will be voted on at the November meeting next year and then made available to us. And that document is intended to reflect on what we need to do to better provide for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the church. And we also have a book in the works now that will be published by Word on Fire and available in about a year that deals with the same thing, topics like inclusive education, etc. By the way, inclusive education is one of those areas where the church is really lagging, where we really need to work much more substantially to bring inclusive education programs into our schools so that all of a family's children can go to school in the same school. One doesn't have to be dropped off at a public school where there's an inclusion program that's paid for by the government and may not be the education you want your child to have, while you bring your other children to your parish school. So I just wanted to add those couple of things to our comments that we made before. I also added a link to an article that I saw after the seminar yesterday to the Day 1 seminar page. If you go to where those past seminars are recorded, there's a link to a wonderful article that was in the Free Press on the danger of egg donation for women who become egg donors. So you might want to look that up. Of course, if there's a danger to a person who's donating eggs because of the hyperstimulation of the ovaries and the flood of hormones that are put into a woman's body to cause that to happen, those who participate and benefit from that are culpable in making that market grow. And so we need to be aware of that as well. So anyway, going on to the topic for the day. So it's commonly known nowadays that we're in a mental health crisis in this country. The U.S. bishops have undertaken an effort to raise the awareness of this in the church. You can go back and see Dr. Patricic and Bishop Barron's Word on Fire show where they talked about this initiative of the USCCB. But it's something that is certainly real. And this is an article from about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, December 8th, 2023, that was titled America's Mental Health Crisis. And it mentioned in that last line that according to a CNN Kaiser Family Foundation poll, 90% of Americans agree that we are in a mental health crisis. So I was invited to speak at a Converging Roads conference. It's sponsored by the John Paul II Foundation for Marriage and the Family, a medical ethics conference. And I met there a psychologist named Anthony Isako, who is a professor at Chatham University in Pittsburgh, and he presented on this mental health crisis. And it was really the first time that I was made aware of it. I read the news and we know that it's happening, but I was astounded by the statistics that he provided in his presentation and the reality of how serious this situation really is. So a lot of what I have here is borrowed from Anthony's slides with his permission. I would encourage you to tune into him and the work that he does if you're interested in this topic, because there's a lot of work within the church and working with seminarians and priests and others to support an awareness and a healing of people with mental health issues and a healthy spirituality and a healthy masculinity among men who are preparing for the priesthood. John Haidt, of course, his name is probably familiar to some. He wrote a book that's very popular now called The Anxious Generation. And he talked about the role that social media is playing in increased anxiety and depression among young people, especially young girls and young women in our culture. So this statistic is from 2023. He has tracked from 2012 to 2013 a substantial increase. He says we fell off a cliff at that point in the severity of the mental health crisis among young people. And that was with the smartphone and social media, high-speed internet becoming more broadly available and the impact that that had. And of course, mental health issues have always existed, and anxiety and depression are not uncommon situations, but the COVID-19 pandemic certainly exacerbated that and really increased the severity of them. So just to go through some of the statistics to begin with that Dr. Isako presented in his presentation. These are statistics from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention from 1921. And it just shows that from January to December in 2019, the reported incidence of anxiety was 7.4 to 8.6%, and depression 5.9% to 7.5%. But look just into the next year and the following year, this is post-pandemic, well, not post, but within the pandemic, April 2020 to August 2021. Look at the increase in statistic here. Anxiety went from 7.4 to 8.6% up to 28.2% to 37.2%. Stunning, stunning. Depression went from 5.9% to 7.5% to 20.2% to 31.1% in just this period of time. So we can see that certainly the COVID pandemic had a significant impact on mental health in this country. And we all know what the COVID pandemic brought to us. It brought to us lockdowns, and it brought to us social isolation. It brought to young people, of course, more reliance on their devices and their smartphones for interactions, and so many of those interactions are unhealthy. So we can see so many ways that this mental health crisis was exacerbated by those lockdowns. But I was listening to Dr. Isako's presentation, and I kept thinking about people with disabilities, because we know people with disabilities are so much more significantly impacted by things like this. So I started looking into what the statistics are there. So if we look at disability and mental health, these are prevalence rates in 6 to 21-year-olds, the first two lines at the top here, of individuals who have intellectual or developmental disabilities, and they're taken through two instruments that are used to measure things like anxiety, things like ADHD, things like different sorts of mental health issues. So we can see that in this one scale, the Developmental Behavioral Checklist, which is a scale that's used primarily to measure these things with individuals who have intellectual or developmental disabilities, there was a 38% prevalence. And the Child Behavior Checklist is one that's used for typical individuals, but in this case it was a scoring instrument that was used for individuals, once again with IDDs, shortcut so I don't have to say it every time, for intellectual and developmental disabilities, IDDs. There was a 49% prevalence on that scale. The general population, the prevalence of mental health issues that were tested was only 14%. So we can see there is an incredible difference, right? We can see that individuals with individuals with IDDs are significantly more impacted by mental health issues. And the most prevalent conditions that were discovered, and these data was pulled together in 2020. So we can see that the major or the most prevalent conditions were ADHD, which was 30% prevalence in the IDD population and only 9.8% in the general population. We can see the conduct disorders, acting out, etc. Conduct disorders, 21% in the IDD population and only 5.7% in the general population. Anxiety disorders, 34% in the IDD population, 9.6% in the general population, and depressive disorders, 5% as opposed to 2.6% in the general population. So indeed we can see from the statistics that were compiled about the same time those CDC reports were pulled together that there is a significantly higher prevalence of these depressive disorders, bipolar disorders, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, various things that are measured from these instruments that were used to see what the impact is of these conditions on the IDD community. So significant, as we can see. So what's the major factor that impacts our mental health, all of us really, and that's loneliness, right? People who are isolated from community. We talked a lot about community yesterday and the importance of community for people with IDDs to help healthy sexual development develop within them. But we can see that there's sort of a bi-directional relationship between loneliness and mental health. So loss of confidence to socialize, feeling lonely, it leads to negative thoughts. Feeling lonely leads to low mood and less motivation, and not talking about feelings makes things worse. Feeds into loneliness, causes mental health issues, feeling disconnected when among others, negative perceptions of others, low self-esteem, etc. And so people just get caught in this spiral, right? Where you're lonely and it increases your mental health whatever, anxiety, depression, whatever it might be, and then that locks you more within yourself and isolates you more from community, and so we can find ourselves in this horrific spiral. And if we see then the impact of loneliness on individuals, we can see it impacted, and this again it's called a crude prevalence, rough numbers. People with disability, loneliness, they were impacted 17.2% of the population as opposed to 4.2% without a disability. Once again, higher rate affecting the population of individuals with disability. Low perceived social supports, 15.5% within the IDD community, 6.5% in the typical community. Social isolation, 7.1% as opposed to 4.5%, and then it breaks this down into individuals that have one or two or none of those conditions. So, of course, loneliness is a lack of close, intimate contact with other individuals, right? It makes us feel empty or sometimes anxious or self-conscious or whatever. If we have no social network, it's easy for us to become sad, unhappy, depressed. That can become pathological at some point. Social supports are having a network of family, of course, friends and community members who we can rely on for that sort of emotional support. And then when we're talking about social isolation, that's just a complete or a near complete lack of contact with people outside. And unfortunately, many people who have intellectual or developmental disabilities will fall into this category of they're really socially isolated. And I mentioned yesterday, I think, or maybe it was the day before, that many people with intellectual and developmental disabilities report that really the only friends they have are their family or their caregivers. So family family is family. We expect our family to love us and to care for us and to be with us. Caregivers are paid. So those are your only friends, your family and people who are being paid to take care of you and watch out for you. Not so great. So going on to the next, this is called a diathesis stress model. And what this does is it shows where the threshold of tolerance for mental health conditions can exist based upon two factors, a stress level and vulnerability. So if you have low stress and low vulnerability, you're minimally affected or mildly affected, right? The more extreme comes for people who have, people who are under extreme stress but have more resilience will be able to withhold, extreme stress and low resilience will also have a higher incidence on the threshold, whereas if you have a resilience but low stress, you'll be less affected, if that makes sense to you. So we can see that certain individuals will have a vulnerability to these factors, obviously people with IDDs will be dependent on other people. They won't, we talked some about autonomy yesterday, they'll feel like they don't have control over their own lives. They might feel insecure at work or at school if they're blessed to have work and school. They won't have maybe a voice in decision-making for themselves. They'll have a poor self-perception. These various things make us vulnerable and then add stresses to those, and loneliness is a stressor, right? Financial insecurity, and many people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are not employed and are dependent on Social Security for their income, and they're living many in poverty, especially as they become adults and family situations change. Unemployment, bad friendships and relationships, all these things can add to stress. So all these things, when they're combined, we can see for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, they might have very high stress situations in their lives, and their vulnerability is high. So that doesn't bode well for mental health. But protective factors can intervene and help ameliorate the situation to some degree or lessen the situation to some degree. And those, of course, can be social supports or positive relationships with others, good access to health care so you're not concerned about if you get sick, if you're going to be able to take care of yourself, self-esteem, a stable and nurturing environment. And these kinds of things, of course, then can help alleviate some of the stress and the vulnerability factors that can contribute to one's mental health concerns. So a while back, there was a study that was done, and I might have mentioned this sometime in the last couple of days. I've written about it. A study was done of the data that was returned from the euthanasia and assisted dying, to use that term, laws, legalization of these and impact of these laws, and particularly from the Netherlands, and showed that there were people who had disabilities who were had requested death from the government because of their situations of their disability and what was brought about by the disability. And the researchers discovered that there were factors associated with learning disabilities and autism that led to requests for euthanasia and assisted suicide in the Netherlands. Of course, now we don't just have the Netherlands that's providing this. We have a horrible situation now, as we know, in Canada with their medical aid in dying, or medical assistance in dying program, what they call MAID or MAID. But we can see in the situation in the Netherlands here that people were claiming unbearable suffering, loneliness, and social isolation who were requesting to die. And in 30 of the autistic and learning disabled cases, which was 77% of them, loneliness and social isolation were listed as factors that led to the person's unbearable suffering and their plea for euthanasia. The difference between euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, as you probably may understand, if you don't, I'll just clarify. Euthanasia is sometimes called mercy killing. It's horribly named. Euthanasia is like a good death. A good death is having someone kill you, I guess. Physician-assisted suicide is just that. It's when a physician will provide the means for you to kill yourself. So that's the distinction between the two. So the situation here was that loneliness and social isolation were listed as factors that led to a person's unbearable suffering and their desire to be killed, euthanasia. And the professor that was running the study at Kingston University in England was saying that palliative care specialists led the research and told the Associated Press that she had no doubt that those who ended their lives were suffering. But she questioned whether society was happy to send the message that there's no way to help them and it's just better to be dead. Think about that for just a moment, what that means. You know, someone is suffering from loneliness and isolation, and we say that there's no way to help them. Pretty sad state of affairs. So too many have mental health problems, also through loneliness. Tim Nichols reported that too many autistic people can end up developing mental health problems such as anxiety or depression because of loneliness. That's what we're talking about here as well. And we have to add to this the situation in Canada. March 2021, the Canadian House of Commons passed Bill C-7, as it was called, that made medical assistance in dying available to healthy people with disabilities. So these are, we always hear the story, and we're seeing this now taking place, watching it play out in the UK, right? We're seeing that the Parliament in the UK just voted 330 to 257, if I'm remembering the numbers correctly, something like that, in favor of advancing a medical assistance in dying program in the UK. Of course, it's only for people who are terminally ill. That's where it begins. But that's not where this is. Are people who are suffering from loneliness and isolation terminally ill? No, they're not terminally ill. But this Bill C-7 in Canada made healthy people with disabilities able to access requests to be killed through their medical assistance in dying program. So many people with disabilities there can't access disability-related supports that they need to have and live dignified lives in the community so they can get medical aid in dying. They can ask the government to kill them, or to help them kill themselves, rather. So some people say this is like a permanent solution to a temporary situation, right? Loneliness and isolation doesn't have to be a permanent situation. We can take care of that. We know how to do that. We've been doing it for hundreds of thousands or millions of years of humanity. We've been caring for one another, and we've been loving one another. We've been developing communities and caring for our families and the people in our villages and in our cities and in our homes. So to kill someone or to help someone kill themselves because they are lonely or feeling social isolation as a result of another non-terminal situation like an intellectual or a developmental disability is to say that it's just so much easier just to let you die rather than to provide social supports for you so that you can have a healthy mind and feel fulfilled in the community in which you live. So to quote from a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto, reflecting on the situation in Canada, he said, the medical disability becomes the foot in the door to open eligibility for MAID, medical aid in dying. But social suffering pushes the marginalized through that door to seek state-sponsored death for their life's struggles. And you can find that at theconversation.org, website called theconversation.org. And that article was reflecting on the coroner's report from Canada that just came out in October of 2024 that was going through some of the statistics. Some of those statistics which also revealed that, I mentioned this also, that the MAID program is the 5th leading cause of death in Canada. Although someone in Canada who's a part of our IDD community wrote to me yesterday afternoon and said that they're not even sure those statistics are right, that the numbers may actually be higher, because what's listed as the cause of death in these cases is not always the suicide. The cause of death is listed as the medical condition that caused the person to request the suicide. So even those numbers may not be accurate. And we know from news reports just in the last couple of weeks that over 400 cases of the application of MAID in Canada haven't been reported properly. So we don't really know what the numbers are. There is so much stealth around this topic. There are advocacy organizations that are promoting the availability of people being able to kill themselves, or the government being able to authorize doctors to kill them rather than killing themselves. There's so much stealth around this whole thing. And that's what people are saying. Now, if you look at the news today, December 4th, if you look at the news of what's going on in the UK, you can see the whole thing playing out again. People are warning the UK government what's taking place in other places and saying, here we are, the same sort of deceptive advertising is happening there. So anyway, to move on. We should choose a happier topic sometime. We haven't had happy topics. So if we look, there is a lot of good news in the IDD community, and we'll get to that. Maybe the next seminar we'll talk about all the happy things. But this seminar is focused on threats that we need to be aware of, because they are real threats. That last quote that I read from the psychiatrist at the University of Toronto, that the excuse of a terminal illness opens the door, and then people with non-terminal illnesses but who have disabilities are pushed through the door. So if someone's being pushed through the door, that doesn't mean they're necessarily going through that door willingly. And what that means, I don't know. We can use our imaginations again. If you were here yesterday, we were talking about imagination. Okay, so often when we're talking about humanity, we talk about people flourishing, right? And there are certain conditions that allow our lives to flourish. Most of us are flourishing in greater or lesser degrees, I suppose. But, we have education, we have homes, we have warmth in the winter in Rochester. We have our families that love us. We have food on the table. We're fulfilled through our participation in the arts or the life of the mind or these various ways that enable us to flourish. This word flourishing, and the reason for the image here of the plant, is it's really a botanical term. We talk about crops flourishing, and it's a word that really is derived from the agricultural world. It's not really a good term, I don't think, to use when we're talking about people, because plants are easy. If this plant has sunlight and it gets some water, its basic necessities are cared for, there's good custodial care provided for the plant will flourish. The plant will grow, it will be beautiful and green, it will exchange carbon monoxide for oxygen and enrich the environment of our homes. It does everything that it's supposed to do. It'll put food on our table. But we're not plants. We need more than custodial care. If that's all we get, then that's what we get, right? Clearly, this person is not happy. This person is not flourishing. So we can use that image to think of what we're doing. Many people with IDDs are just given this kind of custodial care. They don't benefit from the enrichment within their lives that other people have access to. And again, that can result in, in mental health complications, anxiety, depression, various other things. So, what do we do about it? And this seminar is, threats to the disabled and what we can do. So, how can we recover? What does recovery look like in this situation? And this is a quote from the article that I had the graphic of at the very beginning that showed that 90% of Americans in this Pew Research agreed that there was a mental health crisis. Thomas Ensel, the doctor who wrote that article, said, "What is recovery? It's more than a reduction in symptoms or even a remission of illness. Recovery requires a focus on the 3 Ps," and he called those 3 Ps people, place, and purpose. So again, many of us can find our people. We have our families, we have our social groups, we belong to a health club, or we play sports on a team, or we do whatever we do. We have access to people. We have our parishes, and ideally our parish is a big support of our people that believe as we believe. And we're welcome there, and we're embraced, and we're brought into those communities. The place can be our homes, should be our parishes as well. I know we've been in our parish for many years, and I walk in, and the smells are familiar, and the faces are familiar, and I feel at home there. I feel, you can smell the incense from the previous Mass, and you can see friends that you've known for many years, and you feel like it's your family, like you belong. You go to parish events and have great conversations. What is our purpose? Well, here's my purpose, acting it out right here with you. All of us, many of us, have a purpose because we've benefited from education or training or skills, talents, gifts that enabled us to find a purpose, and that purpose to be welcomed and embraced in the world in which we find ourselves. But that's not always the case for people, and it's in fact rarely the case for people who have intellectual and developmental disabilities. So this idea of flourishing is probably not a good term to use when we're talking about human persons. It works for plants, but we need more than just the custodial care that a plant requires. And in Catholic social teaching, we find this phrase, integral human development. And that word integral is an important one. It means lots of things come together to help a person thrive, right? To help a person realize our humanity, realize the gifts that we have been given within our talents, but also the gifts that we've been given of other people and how we are a gift to other people as well. So it's not in any way a reductionist sort of term. It's an embracing term. And it makes clear that one aspect of human wellness is to be in relationship or in what's transcendent. And that relationship of transcendence is a relationship with God. So it's important for us to recognize first and foremost that that relationship of transcendence is one that's an essential one to cultivate in all of us. And a failure to recognize that transcendent nature of who we are as human persons. We talked about that a little bit yesterday when we were talking about who we are made to be. God created man, male and female. He created them with a purpose. We didn't really talk about the spousal meaning of the body directly yesterday, but we referred to it indirectly. And so we have a purpose, a transcendent purpose we have to come to understand. God has us here for a reason, all of us. So if we fail to recognize that, then we're really kind of taking a reductionist view of who we are as human persons. We're not understanding what we are. And Pope Emeritus Benedict wrote beautifully about this in Caritatis in Veritate, which was his encyclical letters that is a great one to go back and read if you haven't. So what do we need? What do we need to be whole? Certainly we need this transcendent relationship, as we mentioned, but we need adequate health care and support, education, employment, autonomy appropriate for our personal safety, as we talked about yesterday. And Matt raised the question, maybe we should be talking about freedom rather than autonomy, which I've thought a lot more about since yesterday. And I think that's, we understand freedom in a different way than we understand being autonomous. None of us can be completely autonomous. We can make a lot of decisions for ourselves, but in respect for others, our freedom has to be limited by the environments that we find ourselves in. Makes perfect sense. So, more than plants, more than all of these things are important. But again, a true development, a true integral development requires the integrating principle in our lives. And the integrating principle is our relationship with Jesus Christ, fundamentally, through which we have relationships with others. So true development requires attention to the spiritual life, serious consideration of the experiences of trust in God, spiritual fellowship in Christ, reliance upon God's providence and mercy, love and forgiveness, self-denial, acceptance of others, justice and peace, etc. And all of these things are what Pope Emeritus Benedict wrote in this beautiful encyclical Caritatis in Veritate. So, and they all reflect back to the transcendent nature of the human person and our need for an awareness of who we are as spiritual beings in relationship to God. So this is another quote of Pope St. John Paul II from the same document that we built yesterday's seminar talk around, this talk that he gave on the dignity and rights of mentally disabled person. And he said, the starting point for every reflection on disability is rooted in the fundamental convictions of Christian anthropology. Even when disabled persons are mentally impaired or when their sensory or intellectual capacity is damaged, they are fully human, independently of the conditions in which they live or of what they are able to express. They have a unique dignity and a special value from the very beginning of their life until the moment of their natural death. And that is understood, again, through that transcendent relationship. So what is the Christian anthropology? John Paul II said, I think this was quoting actually from Gaudium et Spes, but he said in his first encyclical letter, Redemptor Hominis, that Christ fully reveals man to himself and brings to light the Most High calling, or his Most High calling. That's true for all of us. It's true for you. It's true for me, everyone in this room. It's true for every person that God has created. There aren't two anthropologies that we follow. There is one anthropology. We are all created in God's image with that same dignity. So the central idea here is the redemption and the task of salvation which the church carries out in the world, and it consists in helping everyone to discover the full truth about who they are, what their being is, the truth that can only be found in Christ, and the human person's transcendent dimension, as I keep stressing here, that must be acknowledged and nurtured. So how do we do that? How do we do that? It's by being constantly aware, again, as I have already said and will repeat, that all of us, we don't have two anthropologies. We don't have an anthropology for typical folks and then another anthropology for disabled folks with IDDs, physical disabilities, or any kind of disability, or any kind of color, or any kind of anything else, right? We're all created in God's image, and what a beautiful image we can imagine God is in the beautiful diversity of humanity. So we're all created in God's image, and God's image is a relational one, right? God's image is an image of a Trinitarian God, and the image that we think of when we think of the image of God is the image of Jesus Christ for the incarnation, which is such a beautiful image to behold and such a great gift of our God to give us, that he humbled himself to come to take on our flesh and to live among us in the world so that we can come to know God's love for us. So we have to focus on that incarnational reality and what that means for each of us. And we understand that, again, that relational nature of the Trinity is expressed in Jesus Christ and is shared with his Father and then in turn shared with us through the grace of the Holy Spirit. So our capacity for that relationship with God and with others is a reflection of the interrelational life of God himself, which is the Trinitarian communion of divine persons. And that inner that capacity for relationship, no one can judge from one person to another. You can't judge mine. I can't judge your relationship. We can see a lot of externals, and we can think that we have a lot of information that we can gather about a person's relationship with God from those externals. But there have been a lot of frauds through time, so we can't necessarily do that. That relationship is an intimate one. It's a personal one. And it's a relationship that needs to be freed to be able to be nourished by the grace of the sacraments and by a community of faith. And that's where that relationship can really come to be understood and appreciated and to thrive in community. So again, we talked yesterday again about the importance of the Christian community, and just to emphasize it here once again, it's very, very important that we have a community. So John Paul II mentioned people being fully human, having special value and a unique dignity. And just to reinforce those, 3 comments that he made through a couple of quotes here from the International Theological Commission, a document on communion and stewardship. The dynamic relationship between God and the image of God is one of intimacy and love as it is expressed in the Blessed Trinity and lived in the Church. Just to reinforce what we've just said. All persons have a natural desire to see God in whose image we are, and therefore we have a dynamic orientation to the divine. We all have a dynamic orientation to the divine. Some people are not able to mine the reality of that because of their social isolation, their lack of relationship. Certainly, the inner life can grow to some extent, but we learn so much about the beauty of community, the nature of God as we share the love that we have with one another in our communities. Such an important thing to focus on and to meditate on. So John Paul II again in his inauguration said, I implore you, allow Christ to speak to man. So how do we allow Christ to speak to man? As Pope St. John Paul II said, well, we have to allow someone the freedom and the opportunity to grow in that relationship. Again, through participation in the life of the Church, participation in the sacraments, certainly through which grace comes to us so that we can grow in faith, hope, and charity, and an inner life and that inner relationship with God and reach our own state of divinization, which was really the goal of us all, right? So all that happens again within the body of Christ. What is recovery then? What's the solution for the mental health crisis for everyone? But we're talking specifically about the IDD population today. So it's more than just a reduction of symptoms or even a remission of illness. It's a recovery. The recovery rather focuses on these 3 Ps: people, place, and purpose. Say it with me: people, place, and purpose. So those 3 things we have to remember as the core principles here. And we really, St. Paul's image of the body of Christ is such a beautiful one. And if we go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and read it again, we can see that it's not just the grand and glorious gifts, the most important parts of the body, the head, the whatever that we have. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you, nor again the head to the feet, I don't need you. Indeed, the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are all the more necessary, as St. Paul says. The parts of the body that seem to be weaker are all the more necessary. But God has so constructed the body as to give greater honor to a part that is without it, so that there may be no division in the body, but that the parts may have the same concern for one another. And that's our task in the body of Christ. So how that plays out in reality, just a couple of statistics to run through as we start to come through the end here. And these are statistics that are compiled by Dr. Eric Carter, who is now the Luther Sweet Chair of Disability at Baylor University and runs the program in disability there. 44% of adults with severe disabilities attend a place of worship once a month, compared to 57% of people without disabilities. we think about those statistics that I showed you at the beginning, right? The higher incidence of mental health issues of individuals with IDDs as opposed to those without. These are 44% of adults with severe disabilities only attend a place of worship once a month. The rest of them don't. The rest of them are home, lonely. Fewer than one half of children and young people with autism and other disabilities participated in religious services at any point in the previous year. More than 1 out of 3 families have changed their place of worship because their children weren't included or welcomed in their parish. These are statistics that aren't specifically Catholic statistics. Eric drew these statistics from a broad base of Christian communities, but my conversations with people that work in disability ministry at the diocesan and parish level, we track pretty similarly to these. So if we're not inviting people in, if we're excluding people or not making a welcoming environment for people with disabilities, they won't come. They won't come. 67% of people surveyed reported that they felt uncomfortable talking with a person with a disability, and this is from a Scope poll that was done in Great Britain in 2014. And I actually see that as good news. 67% of people surveyed reported that they felt uncomfortable talking with a person with a disability. We can fix that. And that's what we're doing right now. We're trying to fix that. We're trying to get rid of the fear of disability, the discomfort. What was the biggest concern that they had? It wasn't a fear of the disability itself, but they were afraid that they might seem patronizing or say something that would upset the person. We can fix that. That's the good news here. We can fix that. That happens through education. That happens through familiarity. It happens by bringing people with disabilities into our parishes and welcoming them and giving them something to do in the parish. So they are visible, so they feel needed, so they feel like they have a purpose and a place in people. Eric Carter put this sort of wheel of belonging together, and it's a kind of a circle of progressive levels of where we need to go from being just simply accepted, like, okay, you can come to church, welcome, sit there, but to really know people, to welcome them, to invite them to be involved in parish activities, to acknowledge their presence, to be present to them and to love them, to show them that they're needed, befriend them, let them know that they're cared for. Maybe they need a ride to the doctor. Maybe they need a ride to some place that they need to go. Maybe they'd like to come to Sunday dinner at your house. And then know that they're supported. And all of that, when that works together in the beautiful sort of way that it should, it results in the center of the wheel here, which is a sense of belonging for people. So people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, we don't want them to feel isolated. We don't want them to feel lonely because we know that that increases the likelihood that they'll suffer from these mental health issues of depression, anxiety, fears of various sorts. All of those things that we showed in that other wheel toward the beginning of this that work together with loneliness, contributing to mental health issues, and mental health issues causing people to plunge more deeply into loneliness and just spiraling down in this circle of despair and poor mental health. So what can we do? Again, in our parishes, we need to welcome them in. We need to make them feel like they belong, like they have a purpose. They can be altar servers. They can be greeters at the back of the parish. They can take up a collection. Maybe they can sing in the choir if they have the right kind of voice. My son would love to, and we won't let him anywhere near the choir loft because he loves to sing, but he's not a voice that the choir would want in the choir loft. But maybe there are situations where people can. Parish events, parishes have socials, or they have fish fries or inland on Fridays. Bring them in and help them work at the fish fry. Or there are chores and things that need to be done around parishes. There's no reason that parishes can't employ at a manageable rate individuals with disabilities to take care of altar linens, to come weed the garden, to mow the grass, to do all sorts of things that will give them a sense of purpose, that will help them know that they're welcome, that they're embraced, that they're a part of the community, that they're loved, that we want them there, and that they have value to us. Just some ideas. So this was another quote of Pope Benedict from Caritas in Veritate, which I think is an important one because it so often, I know in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, of course, like everywhere, we have a big Catholic Charities appeal, and a part of that appeal goes to fund the needs of schools, special education, goes to fund, we have in our Catholic Social Services in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Division. It has group homes and facilities for more compromised individuals to live in, so it goes to fund that. So, we can write our check to Catholic Social Services every year and know that we're taking care of the problem because we're helping support these ministries. Don't stop doing that. That's a great thing to do because those ministries need your support. A lot of those ministries have substantial federal and state support too, but they still need our support. But let's just look at what Pope Emeritus, now deceased, God bless his memory, had to say here. Man does not develop through his own powers, nor can development simply be handed to him. In the course of history, it was often maintained that the creation of institutions was sufficient to guarantee the fulfillment of humanity's right to development. Unfortunately, too much confidence was placed in those institutions, as if they were able to deliver the desired objective automatically. In reality, institutions by themselves are not enough, because integral human development is primarily a vocation, and therefore it involves a free assumption of responsibility and solidarity on the part of everyone. So, when you go to Mass Sunday, look around. 2 to 3% of the population has intellectual and developmental disability. That means for every 100 people in your parish, you should see 2 or 3 people with some sort of disability, right? I know we have several in our parish. So look around. Ask what you can do to make that person feel welcome. If your parish doesn't have a disability ministry, which many parishes don't, start one. Take an interest in people with disabilities. Know that from those statistics I showed you earlier, many of them aren't in church. We've got to find them. We've got to bring them in first before we can help them feel welcome. We have to find out where they are. Bring them in. Invite them in. Start a disability ministry in your parish and provide social experiences for them. Again, I ran through a list off the top of my head of possible ways to engage people with disabilities and in the life of the parish so that they feel welcome. Provide people. That's you and me. Let's provide ourselves. Provide a purpose by giving them something to do and even being there for us to love and for them to love us. And people, place, and purpose. We can work on those 3 things. Okay? So, just as a side note, this is a beautiful old holy card that I couldn't resist to include here from Lourdes, France. And when Mary appeared to Bernadette, I don't want to torture you with my horrible French pronunciation, but I will only say that voulez-vous me faire la grâce means vous is the formal address. So the Blessed Mother appeared to Bernadette, and she didn't say tu, she didn't say the familiar address. She addressed her formally, and she said, "Will you do me the favor of coming here for 15 days?" The Queen of Heaven approached this little 15-year-old shepherd girl who some people think had at least some learning difficulties, and we know she did because she didn't succeed in school. Maybe she had some sort of intellectual disability. We don't know. They weren't tracking that sort of thing back then where she lived. But the Blessed Mother, the Queen of Heaven, comes to her and addresses her in a formal way and says, "Will you do me the favor of coming here for 15 days?" When we invite people with disabilities into our parishes, what happens if we don't have this formal address in our language? But what happens if we address them with the same courtesy? Will you do this the favor of joining us at this parish event that we're going to have? Will you do us the favor of participating in this new group for people that I'm pulling together to provide experiences or fun or whatever it's going to be for people with disabilities, a Bible study, a faith formation program, whatever it might be? Will you do us the favor of joining our parish community? Rather than making them feel like you're condescending to them to allow them to come, ask them if they would please come and join you. So thank you for these 3 days. I have to thank again the production staff here at Word on Fire. This is just such a great team. Doug Cummins and Vaughn, Matt, of course, always fabulous. And Sophie, who's out there coordinating things in the office. So many thanks to everyone who pulls this together. It's always such a pleasure to be here. So I hope we have some questions.
Oh, we do. We
Good.
do. And also thanks to Nate, who's back in
Nate!
the back in the
That's
booth.
right, Nate's back. Okay.
Yeah, he's behind the glass.
Back there,
yeah,
invisible
he's behind
back
the
in
glass
the
wall.
booth.
We have many questions, and as usual, some start at the more abstract level, and some are asking for some practical advice. So we'll once again start out in the ether, and then come back down to earth. All of it is very important. But I want to start just by saying to you, Morgan, on behalf of the Institute, and I don't think this is presumptuous for me to say, on behalf of all of our viewers and all of our Institute members, thank you for this content. I was looking around, and I cannot find any other organization doing what you're doing, what we're doing, but what you're doing on behalf of those with disabilities. So one thing I want to tell all of our Institute members, if you have friends who either are interested in this topic, or maybe or family members who have they're caring for those with intellectual or developmental disabilities, we're going to make all of this available on our YouTube channel as a series. So we're going to get that up as soon as we can. Please stay tuned for news about that so you can disseminate it more broadly. We'll be working on that. But in the meantime, let's get to some of those questions. So at the more abstract level, but again, equally important, especially speaking as an academic, you talk about euthanasia, you talk about abortion, you talk about mental health, and you talk about care for those with disabilities, and those can seem like all kinds of separate issues, and that we as Catholics may think, well, I'll be the pro-life guy, or I'll be the anti-euthanasia guy, or I'll be the disability rights guy. But you've also been throughout sort of showing how there's both a common problem and a common solution. So could you speak more to that sort of foundational culture of life versus cultural death, and how that works in your own thinking?
Yeah, I just read an article that was published at Catholic World Report yesterday, if anyone wants to look that up, on the abortion and euthanasia thing, and also brought the wars that we're facing into it as well. And, Pope John Paul II, again, was the first to use these terms, I think, culture of death and culture of life. And they're all intertwined. And I was preparing to write that article, I noticed that Pope John Paul II, often when he would talk about abortion, he talked about euthanasia in the same sentence. He didn't separate them, and they were the same. They both are connected to the same root cause. And it's the root cause, it's the root cause of the culture of death. It's a disregard for God's law, and it's a disregard for human life as a consequence of it. We talked about, yesterday or the day before, I don't remember which, but we talked about the neo-paganism, how Christianity seems to be on the wane, although if you have our perspective here at Word on Fire, what's going on in this ministry and the number of people that are coming in, you kind of see something other than that happening. It's phenomenal to see. But broadly, we hear that Christianity is on the wane. We talk about living in a post-Christian world now. Well, what happens as a consequence of that is all of these disregards for the most beautiful part of God's creation, that part of creation that he waited until the very last day to bring into existence. That's us. That's the point of attack of Satan. The point of attack of the devil is to attack God's special creation. Because in attacking us, he indirectly attacks him, right? Because God breathed his breath into us. He gave us a soul that is destined to be with him forever. He breathed into us the breath of life in that beautiful image that we have in the first couple of chapters of Genesis. So that's Satan's point of attack. And now Satan's point of attack, it's all the same. The culture of death all comes, I think, from that. It's how do we attack? You can just imagine them in some demonic conference table sitting around saying, okay, what can we do next? Okay, so we're going to kill babies. We're going to convince people that a baby is not a human person in the womb. Oh, we got that down. Great. Look at the number of abortions that are happening throughout the world now. Look at the number of abortions that have happened in the last 50 years. We're doing great there. Let's go on to something else. Oh, old people, sick people. Let's get rid of them too. We can get rid of old people and sick people. Oh, but then there are all those people in between. So what are we going to do? Well, God created man and woman, male and female. He created them. How can I really get in there and distort this image that God has created that's reflective of him, a he and a she? Well, let's mix them up and confuse them, and let's make he's think they're she's and she's think they're he's, and then let's convince everyone in the world that they have to bow down to that flawed ideology. Great, we're doing great. I think it's all the same. I just think that it's just all this interwoven tangle. It can only be demonic. Look around. Look around. The level of confusion that our society is in right now can only have one source.
That's
and
so
the father
powerful
of lies.
when you frame it that way. You're having a C.S. Lewis sort of Screwtape Letters moment. I mean, you're absolutely right. All of those ultimately seem to be based in the father of lies, with the goal of what can be done to decimate and destroy humanity. Wow, that's sobering. So another question related to anthropology, or as we were watching, I found it just extremely uplifting and dignifying the way that you emphasize the unity of human nature, the unity of human dignity, and the fact, like the both the moral and we could say the metaphysical, anthropological fact that someone with disabilities is not different than someone without disabilities at that most basic level of human nature. And at the same time, you note that male and female, he created them. So we have some questions related to serving the community of those with disabilities, recognizing that there is this fundamental distinction between men and women. How can we be attentive to recognize that fundamental difference that's built into creation and intended by God in a way that recognizes that perhaps there's some different needs depending on whether they're women or whether they're men?
Wow. Is that your question, or did that come in?
It's a distilled question.
Yeah, that's
we have another
a tough
question
one.
about men in particular suffering from higher rates of suicide.
Yeah.
Which we're seeing across the board as well.
Yeah. Well, we always have to acknowledge the distinctions between men and women. And again, we can't make a distinction between people with intellectual or developmental disabilities and other people, because I think that, I don't want to go back to a negative example of a concern, but again, women with intellectual and developmental disabilities, because of their femininity, are victims of males who are aggressive and see something less than a human person there, I guess. I mean, I can't imagine how people can do what they do. So I think we have to be very protective of everyone. And I'm not saying that boys and young men are immune from this either, because there are also problems there. So I think we have to acknowledge the difference between men and women. Certainly, if we're talking about these issues, there are women who, because of women's sexual development, there can be difficulties when they reach their sexual maturity, just in hygiene issues, as we all understand, without having to get too specific, I'm sure. But there's some vulnerabilities there, even within the medical community, who want to control that, even to the point of hysterectomies or whatever that will resolve a problem if it's, if there's a medical condition there. Someone wrote to me a while back and said that her daughter, who has, I think it was Down syndrome, I don't remember for sure, but was having some severe medical issues, and the doctor wanted to put her on artificial contraceptives, hormonal treatments in this case, to resolve the issues. That's fine, because the woman is not sexually active, she's not married and doesn't intend to be, and the church would not see that as a contraceptive act because there is no intent to require the need of contraception. So that's okay. So, there are issues, there are biological facts that we have to acknowledge as separate from men and women. But, the organizations, a lot of sports are now combined. It's great to keep some sports separate still, I think. And I'm not talking about all the issues in sports nowadays that have gone way off the rails. I'm just talking about girls' sports and boys' sports. So in Special Olympics, most of them are combined now. But, to find things that provide good male role models, masculine role models for the boys, feminine role models for the girls, I think are great things to do. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how beyond that to answer the question, other than just acknowledging that they are different. Yeah,
comprehensive answer, and that there are specific vulnerabilities. So we had some questions about the relationship between mental health and medication as a possible solution, or at least something that could assist, and how that relates to those with disabilities. What's your sense of the role of say, the typical medications that are given to those, and recognizing that you can go to a general practitioner and leave with a prescription for Xanax, if you don't have a disability. Are there particular cautions that need to be taken into consideration when medicating for mental health issues among those with disabilities?
You know, I'm not a doctor, and I really hesitate to even go there.
Yeah, just anecdotal
So
experience. Have you seen? Are there any abuses in the medical community that we're aware of, where it's just, give them some pills and kind of put them into a stupor and that'll take care of the problem?
I don't know, but given the state of things, I could imagine that could be the case. I think what we do know about people with Down syndrome more is, there's some controversy now in the clinical trial area as they're working and trying to find drugs that will be beneficial to stave off Alzheimer's disease, which is very common and almost universal among individuals with Down syndrome at a younger age than people would typically develop Alzheimer's disease or Alzheimer's-like dementia, because their bodies react differently to medications. And again, I'm not a doctor, so you need to find someone that can give you better advice than I can here, but I just do know that there are some sensitivities to some medications that individuals with chromosomal anomalies especially might have, I think, that others wouldn't. So you just have to be careful. That's the only thing I can say.
Sure, important to keep that into
I never watched television, but in the hotel I was just so tired I didn't feel like I could read without falling asleep, and I felt like I needed. So the commercials are unbelievable, and they advertise drugs all the time on these commercials.
It's like every third commercial.
And they were advertising some antidepressant medication, and I was just looking through. It just kept flashing through these potential side effects.
Yeah.
So my personal belief is if you don't need a pill, don't take a pill. If there's any way to do something other than through medication.
So I have a question here within the same sort of general arena about therapy and its efficacy among those with disabilities. Is that an area that provides some hope?
Sure, I think so. You have to find someone that's very good and knows what they're doing, and you have to find someone that has a proper anthropological understanding of who we are. And
that was the next part of that
point.
Question was, do you have, can you point at our viewers to any resources of Catholic health, mental health professionals? Is there a body? Is there a group, a network?
Yes, there are some. There's the Catholic Medical Association that is sort of the general sort of medical organization for Catholic physicians, but I'm trying to remember what it's called. It might be it's called something as simple as a Catholic Psychotherapists Association or something like that. But there are 2 or 3 mental health, specifically Catholic mental health organizations that you can reach out to, and some very good Catholic therapists nowadays. I don't think it was always the case, but I think now in fact, I was just listening to a podcast the other day and they were talking about this. There are some really, really excellent Catholic mental health professionals out there now, and they may not be in your community, but you can certainly go online to these organizations and run down resources and see what you can find. I mentioned Anthony Isako is just such a great guy. He's in Pittsburgh. Just from my conversation with him, he wasn't aware of disability at all and related to mental health, and it sort of piqued his interest. I don't know if he'd have any resources, but I can try to find someone.
Well, that's one of the
names.
Yeah, we can continue that in your community, and we can post those resources if you find them. So there are many questions about asking for practical advice of how we can help families, how can we help those with disabilities within our parishes. And then you gave this great list right towards the very end, some very concrete advice. Now, connected to that is more sort of the sacramental dimension. How can we help our churches? How can we support our priests? How can we even support our bishops to help our churches provide that sacramental relationship with the Lord, through the church?
Yeah, there's a document that the bishops put out several years ago now, but it's not outdated by any means, and it's called Guidelines for the Celebration of Sacraments for Persons with disabilities or with intellectual disabilities. I'm not sure exactly how it's worded, but Guidelines for the Celebration of the Sacraments for Persons. Just type that into a search browser and USCCB and you'll find it. If you have any problem in your parish with your pastor allowing your loved ones to receive sacraments, that's the place to go. And it's really well done, and it quotes from canon law and what the canons say about the the need to be generous, certainly, in the provision of sacraments, if there's any question, and what's really required. So if someone is telling you that there's a level of requirement that doesn't comport with what that document says, then give a copy of that document to your pastor and say, well, let's have a conversation about this and see if we can't come to another conclusion.
And your experience is that sometimes happens. Well, pastors will.
Sometimes happens.
So we'll connect it to that. Again, drawing on this this great list that you gave us of action items as laity. Do you want to take this opportunity, and I hope you do, to speak directly to priests and bishops, and include bishops as well? What message do you have on how the church, specifically the ecclesial structure of the church, right, the hierarchy of the church, what can they be doing, not just we, but they be doing to better support our brothers and sisters with disabilities?
Here's my opportunity.
Let it rip.
No, I think I mentioned that the bishops are working on this new document, and that's a great step. I was involved in some of the conversations and study sessions, or whatever they were called, where they were soliciting input on what should be contained in that document. It's being put together by an office, Bishop Barron's chair of the committee, actually. And I said over and over again that what's the implementation plan? You can write a document, like the church is great at writing documents, but we write a document and done. Put it in a drawer and there it goes.
Solved. Yeah.
Solved. We took care of that problem. That's done. We can't allow that to happen with that. And I keep saying that every opportunity I get. And I'm hoping that I've mentioned this book that we're working on. I mentioned Mary O'Callaghan writing a chapter in this book called Indispensable, Catholic Guide to Including People with Disabilities, or something like that. I can never remember titles. And our publications people are better at naming things than I am. But I'm hoping that that's available about the same time this document comes out in November. And we have also this inclusive Catholic education thing going on that I've pulled together people who are from higher education and consultants that help Catholic schools develop inclusion programs, various people who are interested. And it's just such a great group of people who are running foundations that are supporting inclusive education. We have our next meeting on December 17th, and we're working to develop a plan to really push on the issue of inclusive education in Catholic schools. We have no data. We have the National Catholic Educational Association, and it's great, the representation that they provide for Catholic education, the formation that they provide. But they don't, even them, they reported in their last statistics that there's something like 7.9% of pupils in Catholic schools have disabilities, which tells you absolutely nothing. What's a disability? Is it some dyslexia, or is it ADHD, or is it autism, or is it Down syndrome, or what is it? It doesn't really give you the kind of data you need. So we know we need good data. And to get good data, we have to develop a good program to obtain the data, which means we need money to do it. So if any of you know people with a lot of money out there that want to assist with something like this, we have people on deck to do it. We just have to get to it and find the funding to do it. But the value of that is it really shows us the state of inclusive education in Catholic schools. And in my mind, pastors, bishops, some bishops are really great. Bishop Burbidge, I'll give a huge shout out to Bishop Burbidge in the Diocese of Arlington, who is very supportive of this in that diocese through an organization there called Porto Charities that works toward inclusion in the Catholic schools and also works toward finding employment for people with disabilities. We need to take Bishop Burbidge and make Bishop Burbidges into, how many dioceses do we have in the country? Like 180 or something like that?
Lots.
We need that sort of energy and and there may be more, and if there's anyone out there listening, I'm mentioning Bishop Burbidge. I worked for him in Philadelphia when he was the rector of our seminary, and I know him. So that's why I'm singling him out, because I'm so proud of what he's doing there. It's just such a great thing. And people that work with Porto Charities, Carmen Chiappetta may be out there in the virtual world. I don't know. Hello, Carmen, if you are. But Carmen works within that organization and is so energetic as well to promote inclusion in that area and to make connections of people. Melissa Mitchell, who runs our education community with Word on Fire, is very interested also in inclusive education, trying to make that more of a reality. That, I think, is, we talked about, terminal illness being what opens the door to euthanasia, and then people with disabilities are pushed through the door. I think inclusive Catholic education is what opens the door for people with disabilities in the church. And then we get them through that door and we get them in schools where they're in schools with their peers. So I would say priorities for bishops start there. You've got to get the sacramental life of your priest clarified so that sacraments are available, but inclusive education is critical. We have to have it. You talked about the culture of life and how we segment. We can't say that we're pro-life. We can't say that we're pro-life. And I'm remembering a quote from one of the bishop's documents. It's not coming well enough into focus to give it to you, but it's essentially that we can't say that we're pro-life and then not do things like provide Catholic education for kids with disabilities.
Amen.
We have to support them.
Well, let me end with a comment, a representative comment. This is from Eileen. It says, Mark, I am so thankful you are where you are. Thank you for all that you do.
Thank you for that. And you were thanking people who are doing this or whatever. I just have to say thank you to Father Steve Bruno, who is our CEO. And Father Steve's idea was to have this fellowship within Word on Fire, and I am so privileged to be here and to do it. And of course, Bishop Barron as well is very supportive. So thank you, Father Steve, and thank you to Bishop Barron for even making this possible. And I thank you. I mean, I finished the end of my second year with Word on Fire at the end of this month, and it seems like it only began yesterday, and there's so much to do, and I tell people I'm still pinching myself with the reality of it, that Word on Fire has taken this on. So thank you, Matt, for what you do and everyone, and thank you for all of you who tuned into this and have participated and shared your comments. Let's continue to work together to make this happen. It takes all of us.
Perfect way to end, Mark. Thank you, and thank you again to all of you for joining us. Remember, this is all recorded, and we're going to get it up on the platform soon. You can view it as many times as you like. And we'll see you again next month for our next Evangelization and Culture Life seminar. Thanks for making all this possible, and God bless you all. See you again soon.